let more people in. Hopefully there'll be more people coming. But let's get the show on the road. We are on part 2. This is part 2 of a story. And this is obviously a story that's entitled The Rabbinic Fight of the Millennium. And here you have the two combatants. On the left-hand side, you have Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz. Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz is a gentleman. He is a Talmid Chacham. He is a very respected rabbi. He is incredibly savvy in terms of his politics. He knows how to get things done. He's very charismatic. And he also has a cloud of suspicion throughout much of his life that he is a secret follower of Shabbatai Tzvi. On the right-hand side, you have Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Rabbi Yaakov Emden is above reproach. The only thing we can perhaps criticize him with is being something of a zealot, but his reputation is unimpeachable. He is an exceptionally unique individual. And both of these rabbis are very well respected. They are revered in their day. And we are coming in the middle of the story where we have these two individuals in a bit of a spat. Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz is accused of writing kamios, which are amulets that seem to have a Shabbatian reference within them. That is, and he is accused of being a secret follower of Shabbatai Tzvi, and Rabbi Yaakov Emden begrudgingly and reluctantly is dragged into this dispute. But because in the city of Hamburg, and let's take a look and see where Hamburg is. And this is actually going to become very, very important, as you'll soon see. But you'll notice over here, the city of Hamburg is right here towards the middle of Germany, all the way in the north. What country is it close to? It's very close to Denmark. And in fact, this area over here, I think was called Hollerhosen. I think that was the name of this region. I might be incorrect. That actually, at this time, was part of Denmark. So Hamburg is a city in Denmark. So these two rabbis that we've just mentioned, so they're in the previous picture, the locals of the city recognize that they have two very respected and revered rabbis in their midst. One of them is Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Rabbi Yaakov Emden is asked, because he is the greatest Talmid Chacham, who's not the chief rabbi of the triple community, which is, let me show you this picture that I got over here. Where are you? There we go. Now, it's a little more difficult to see on the screen here, but this is the city of Hamburg. It's on the Elbe River. This is actually 3 cities. It's the triple communities. They have Jewish communities in all 3 of these cities. Over here, you have Altona. You can see the city boundaries right along here. This over here is Altona. Altona is actually this part right over here. Right over here, you have Wandsbek, which is the second of the 3 communities. And the big boy in the room is the city of Hamburg. Now, while this territory is Danish territory, Hamburg is not part of Denmark, while Altona and Wandsbek are. And that's going to become really important, as we'll soon see. But we have these 3 triple Jewish communities that are administered by a triple community leadership structure. We have one leadership community that governs all 3 of these communities. Rabbi Emden lives in Altona, which is over here all the way on the west. While Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz lives over here in Hamburg, close to Wandsbek. Because Rabbi Emden is the greatest Talmid Chacham, who's not the chief rabbi, the kamios, these amulets that are found written by Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz, are brought to him. He does not want to rule them. He does not want to look at them. He does not want to get involved. And he looks at them and he doesn't believe that they're written by Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz. He says, I don't know who wrote them, but whoever did write them is a Shabbatian. And he is dragged into this dispute against his will. Finally, this is where we pick up. Because Rabbi Yaakov Emden, as a Talmid Chacham, is the person who the community leadership turned to ask for a rabbinic opinion, he is now on the hit list for Rabbi Yonasan Eibeschutz's supporters. And in fact, there's a threat made against Rabbi Yaakov Emden's life. Rabbi Yaakov had his own shul. He had a shul in his home. And one Marv, this is all taking place in the month of February, a man by the name of, what's his name? It was Shmuel Hecksher. Shmuel Hecksher is a very close friend of Rabbi Emden. His name is going to come up a few times, but he has heard that Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz, the accused Shabbatian, the accused Shabbatian has a group of supporters who are now making threats against Rabbi Yaakov Emden's life. He comes to Rabbi Yaakov Emden to report to him that they are coming to kill you. Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz supporters have justified themselves by claiming that Rabbi Yaakov Emden, the accuser here, is what's called a rodef, somebody who's coming to undermine and be a threat to Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz. Such an individual has a punishment, at least according to the supporters of Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz, the punishment that is the death penalty. So therefore, they are permitted to kill him. Threats have now been made against his life. So Rabbi Yaakov Emden is terrified. He is very disconcerted. He did not want to be involved in this argument at all. So he goes to bed that night and he does not sleep. So what happens? What does he sleep? He's thinking to himself, I still have that meeting tomorrow with the executive committee of the triple community. Perhaps the community leadership could be persuaded to protect me. Maybe we could work out some kind of a compromise so that so that we can avoid a full-scale community war. All of a sudden, he realizes, he sits up and he writes about this in his autobiography. All of a sudden, he gets up and he says, you know what, this isn't about me any longer. This is something so much bigger. I've been very reluctant to get involved, and I did not want to be a part of a disputant here at all. I was sort of forced, it was thrust upon me by the community leadership. We now have an individual who is definitely, at least in my estimation, Yaakov Emden said, is a Shabbatian. This isn't about me any longer. This is about an individual who's attempting to insinuate or to insert heterodoxical beliefs and practices into Judaism. I need to stand up. My father stood up against Nehemiah Chiyun, if you might recall from last week's class. The Chacham Tzvi Ashkenazi was his father. Maybe it's my turn now also to fight the good fight and stand against people who would perhaps undermine traditional Torah and Jewish values. So at Shacharis the next morning, Rabbi Yaakov Emden shows up and he davens, but there's a very large crowd. A number of people are present. It was packed. His own congregation was completely filled to the brim. Not only did he have many people there as his supporters, but he also had Rabbi Yonasan Eibeschutz's folks there as well to see what he was going to do, what was he going to say. And the practice that he had was very comparable to what we do very now. At the end of Shacharis, I get up and I share a very short halachic idea to facilitate an additional Kaddish, the rabbi's Kaddish. That is what he would traditionally do as well. But this time he didn't. He gets up and he basically makes the following statement. Last night, I was informed that my life is in danger. But rather than run away, instead of remaining silent, I've decided that it's definitely a necessity for me now to take a stand and articulate some very fundamental points. I have been approached by a number of people that included the community lay leadership. They've asked me to pass judgment on an amulet. I passed judgment on that amulet. Whoever wrote that amulet is a Shabbatian. I never understood or never took for granted that Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz wrote that Kamiyah. I never took for granted, I never stated, and I do not even still believe that it was he who wrote it, but whoever did was or is an avowed Shabbatian, a follower of Shabbatai Tzvi, and whoever that individual is, it is my view that they have to vindicate themselves. That, he said, includes Rabbi Yonasan Eibeschutz's. If he was the one who wrote it, he needs to make an accounting. He has to explain what exactly he meant by stating the things that he stated and writing the things that he wrote in that amulet. If he comes up in front of the community and claims and explains himself, I will be the first person to beg mechila. I will be the first person to beseech him for forgiveness, and I will be his advocate. I will be his defender until my dying day. However, until that accounting is made, whoever wrote it, and it may be Rabbi Yonasan Eibeschtutz, maybe it wasn't, whoever wrote it is a dangerous individual, and we have to be cautious and concerned. With that, Rabbi Yaakov stepped down, he disappeared into his home, and bedlam broke out within the community. As I mentioned, that there were supporters of Rabbi Yonasan Eibeschtutz who was present for this declaration. They come back, and Rabbi Yonasan Eibeschtutz was beside himself. He called the community leadership and reported to them that Rabbi Yaakov Emden had publicly declared him to be a Shabbatian. Without attempting to hear what Rabbi Yaakov Emden had to say about the matter, the community board, the lay leadership, decided they could not allow anyone, and especially somebody as significant and important as Rabbi Yaakov Emden, to undermine the community leadership. So Rabbi Yaakov Emden was put into chayrim, not a religious chayrim, rather a community chayrim. He was informed by a messenger that his second meeting with the executive committee was canceled. And from this day going forward, he would no longer be allowed to hold services in his shul, something he had been doing for the previous 20 years or so in his own shul. He was placed under house arrest, and he was forbidden to leave his home until further notice. The following morning, an announcement was made in the Great Synagogue, and here's a picture of the Great Synagogue. No, that's not the Great Synagogue. This is the Great Synagogue of Hamburg, basically proclaiming Rabbi Yaakov Emden to be in Cherem, halachic excommunication, and no member of the community was permitted to interact with him, lest they themselves be put into Cherem as well. When he was informed of this, Rabbi Yaakov Emden essentially said, this excommunication is invalid. They did not follow due process. They did not consult with me to ask why I made the declaration that I did or the things that I said. I was not provided no opportunity for defense. They have acted outside of the halachic protocol. As such, they have made a mockery of Torah, of Judaism, of the law. They themselves deserve to be put into Cherem. So he was unapologetic. Now, this brazen response incurred no goodwill from the community leadership, and they attempted to have his rights of residency revoked, forcing him to have to leave Altona within the next 6 months, never to return. By Monday, the following day, this is all taking place on Sunday, if you recall, and this is all taking place during the month of February, 1751, guards had been placed outside of Yaakov's home, preventing him from leaving his home, from walking the streets, and preventing anyone from the Jewish community from entering his house. So Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz, the accused, seems to have won the day. Rabbi Yaakov seems to be completely neutralized, and the threat to the chief rabbi's authority and power is ended, and community peace will now reign supreme. But that was a false conclusion, because Rabbi Yaakov Emden was not a man to be trifled with. Again, his reputation, and still his reputation through to the very end, was above reproach. Nobody has a negative word to say about him, except perhaps he was a zealot in the as far as it went, as far as some things going. We'll cover that soon. He suspected that Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz was a secret Shabbatian, and he was now convinced that because there was no room for debate, discussion, no accommodation was made for his request for some kind of a vindication of the amulet statements to be made, it must be that Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz can present no defense because there wasn't any. He couldn't defend it because they were Shabbatian. You can't write Shabbatai Tzvi is Mashiach and not mean Shabbatai Tzvi is Mashiach. Yes?
Did Rabbi Eybeschutz ever acknowledge that he wrote those?
So I was looking up, hopefully we'll come to that towards the end of the class, but yes, in some of his responses, he did acknowledge that he wrote them. We'll come back to that. Those amulets, they have been found in like in the early 2000s, and papers have been written in like the 2000 teens about, yeah, he really was a Shabbatian, but that's besides the point. We're going to see that really doesn't matter anyways. With nobody local who was willing to defend him, lest they be excommunicated themselves, Rabbi Yaakov reached out to rabbinic colleagues. So he sent 3 letters to 3 really important rabbis of his day. One was the rabbi of Metz. Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz left Metz to become the rabbi in Hamburg, the chief rabbi. There was a man who replaced him, a man by the name of Shmuel Hillman. A second letter was written to the chief rabbi of Amsterdam, who also happened to be Rabbi Yaakov Emden's brother-in-law, who was married to his sister. The third letter that he wrote was to Rabbi Yaakov Yehoshua Falk, and that is, do I have it here? There we go. We don't have a picture of him, but this is a picture of the work that he wrote, the Pnei Yehoshua. And you talk to anyone who's studied in the yeshiva to this very day, the Pnei Yehoshua is a very important work. He probably was the most important rabbi in all of Germany, if not all of Europe at the time. He wrote them letters explaining his predicament, his war. He accused Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz of having scandalous conduct as well as godless convictions. The letters were dispatched secretly, obviously. They slowly made their way around Europe. Meanwhile, Rabbi Yaakov languished under house arrest with local Gentile police outside his door to prevent him from making contact with the outside world. Now, initially, it seemed that the plan to isolate Rabbi Yaakov and his supporters was successful. However, as time passed, it became readily apparent that it wasn't enough. While it's true we silenced the main critic of Yonasan Eybeschutz, he never addressed the criticisms. He never addressed the accusations. He never spoke to it. And that was a very serious problem. So eventually the community leadership met with Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz and said, Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz, you're the chief rabbi. You need to quell the accusations that are being made. Rabbi Yaakov Emden is a very well-respected rabbi in the community, despite the cherem that he's under. His rabbinic credentials are perfect. Why did he come to that conclusion? You need to explain yourself. So he did so. And again, he spoke in the, I did not include a picture of the inside of the great synagogue of Hamburg, but he spoke there. He gave an important address. And this is taking place about a week or two later. This, again, is all taking place on during the month of February. All of this is happening all around during this month. So signs were posted all over the Triple community talking about this incredible speech that Rabbi Yaakov Emden, Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz was going to share. Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz, remember, is the one who's accused of being a secret follower of Shabbatai Tzvi. And he was a fantastic speaker. He was a master orator. And he wove together midrashim, ideas and concepts and rabbinic questions and answers to make a picture of David HaMelech, being chosen by God as the king and having his authority undermined by his son Avshalom, and basically shining some shade or casting shade on Rabbi Yaakov Emden and basically accusing him of being the modern day Avshalom. Then he started talking about the amulets. He said the amulets, they're written based on Kabbalistic secrets. They are based on secrets and minutiae and details that unless you are a real, true Kabbalistic expert, you just won't understand. You just won't know. There have been accusations that have made, but they're made by people who are not experts in the amulets or in Kabbalistic formula. Therefore, you just need to know that that individual is wrong. And as God is my witness, I declare unambiguously that I am completely innocent of all accusations. I have never been involved, nor do I continue to believe in Shabbatai Tzvi. So this was a real problem, because again, he doesn't address the issue. This speech did not cool tensions, because all he did was assert that Rabbi Yaakov Emden didn't have the qualifications to understand what he wrote, when quite unambiguously, Rabbi Yaakov Emden did have those qualifications. He was known to be a Kabbalist in his own right. So he was undoubtedly more than qualified, and everybody in the community knew it. So the divisions in the community began to intensify. These concerns continued to be voiced. Rabbi Yonasan's supporters took what he had to say lock, stock, and barrel, but people who were perhaps admirers of Rabbi Yaakov Emden continued to suspect that there was something amiss. And the people who were stuck in the middle also kind of asked the questions, because most people aren't dumb. And when you don't answer the question directly, it usually means that you're avoiding the question. Brawls broke out in Shul. There's a story of the Chazan of the great synagogue of Hamburg. The picture is here in front of you on the screen. So he was known to be a friend of Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Supporters of Yonasan Eybeschutz, as he was mounting the podium, punched his lights out. He bled from his mouth, according to the descriptions. So the local authorities basically went to the Jewish community and said, you got to stop this. You can have no more services until you, the Jewish leadership, can assure us that there will be no more violence. So people started davening their homes. They formed small little minyanim because everybody was still angry at everybody. The community was literally falling apart. But we still had problems because, okay, they weren't meeting together while at shul, but as they would be walking down the street, as they were going to the grocery store, they would see each other and fights would break out even in the streets. Things were going really, really wrong. It was during this that Rabbi Yaakov Emden basically realized that my life is at risk and I need to get out of here. So he petitioned the city to allow him to leave. The city essentially said, we can't let you leave because the moment you leave the city confines, you are going to be killed by highwaymen or people pretending to be highwaymen who happen to have names like Yoeli and Yankala, who are followers of Yonasan Eybeschutz. There's no way for you to leave without you taking your life in your own hands. But they also recognized that this had to happen. So they agreed with the local authorities that he would leave under the cover of the night when nobody would be around. As well, his wife and children would remain behind so that it would appear as though he was still present in the house. So Rabbi Yaakov left Hamburg and went to Amsterdam, and he basically stayed with his sister and brother-in-law. His brother-in-law was the chief rabbi of the city of Amsterdam. Now, because he arrived depressed, he arrived in poor health, and yeah, it's understandable why he was depressed and why he had poor health. It's patently obvious, and you can definitely sympathize with him. But he also had, as he recovered his health and as his strength improved and as his mood improved, he came to the following recognition. He tried to play a gentlemanly game. He basically said, take a look at these cameos yourself. You come to the conclusion. This is how I understand it. Send these cameos to other rabbis. And that resulted in him having to flee the city that he lived in for the previous 20 years, the city in which he was actually born. He moved away, he came back. His father was the chief rabbi of Hamburg. His children were there, his businesses were there, his home was there. So he's basically said, okay, the gloves have to come off. I have to start writing letters. And he did. He wrote to every single rabbi that he knew. And instead of just talking about the facts, he attempted to collect any negative rumor, any bit of lashon hara, anything that was perhaps scandalous, anything that was that cast any shade under Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz, collected them all into letters and wrote this complete document out and sent it to every rabbi in Western Europe. And eventually these letters also made their way to Eastern Europe as well. He was a man who still had impeccable credentials. He still was greatly revered even at this time. And this was a counterproductive practice, as we're going to see. Many people sided with him. The overwhelming majority of rabbis in Germany suspected that there was a problem and completely believed that Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz wrote questionable cameos. The problem, though, was that the way Rabbi Yaakov Emden was handling it, it was just too extreme. Yes, this person should be neutralized. Yes, perhaps he should have to make an accounting. Yes, he should repudiate Shabbatai Tzvi. But the way Rabbi Yaakov Emden was going about attempting to completely besmirch any good reputation this man had was viewed as being perhaps the greater of the two evils. So while he did have a lot of support, and we're going to talk about what that support was like, he didn't get the groundswell of support that he probably would have had he kept his letters a little bit more, let's say, polite. But let's continue. So again, he's writing these letters, and they're beginning to make their way. Now, meanwhile, two other significant developments began to take place. One was in Rabbi Yonasan Eibeschutz's former city. If you recall, he wrote 3 letters, one to the Rabbi of Metz, Rabbi Shmuel Hillman, another one to Rabbi Yehoshua Falk. Well, Rabbi Shmuel Hillman long suspected that his predecessor was a follower of Shabbatai Tzvi, and when he heard about what was going on in Hamburg, he collected all the local cameos that were still around in the city of Metz. He opened them up. He had them notarized, copied and notarized, and sent around to other Jewish communities, as well as to the Jewish community of Hamburg, with a letter saying, you should look at these things, and you should also call Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz to make an accounting. Don't tell him that you're doing so beforehand, so that he's not able to come up with any contrived explanation. So that's one thing that seems to be coming down that seems to be coming around the corner, lending support to the accusation that there was a problem with Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz. He wasn't who he claimed to be. At the same time, the chief rabbi of Frankfurt, the Pnei Yehoshua, also starts getting involved. He lent his backing to the growing number of rabbis who felt that Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz had to do some explaining. Rabbi Falk was a very savvy, experienced communal rabbi. He was the elder statesman of the rabbinic world at that time. He knew that even if Rabbi Yonasan was guilty, there was no way that the triple community was ever going to fire him, because to do so would be an admission to gross ineptitude, that they hired somebody with this cloud of suspicion that predated the hire and brought him into their community. The only way to resolve this matter would be for Rabbi Yonasan to admit that he had done something wrong, repent publicly, and then be allowed to continue in his role, in his post. He felt that Rabbi Yaakov's strategy of completely delegitimizing Rabbi Yonasan was not adequate to convince people who were on the fence that he was in fact guilty. In fact, he perhaps delegitimized his position to a degree. So he sent messengers to Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz asking him to make a public accounting. Got no response. So he sent letters, no response. He published a letter publicly calling on Rabbi Yonasan to do the right thing and to repent publicly so that everybody could just get on with their lives. That didn't happen. However, when this published version was finally was finally published, it finally became something that people were aware of. Rabbi Yonasan was absolutely livid. He claimed that he never received any of the original letters or any of the original messages, and he responded very decisively and antagonistically towards Rabbi Falk. He claimed that Rabbi Falk was an ignoramus. He claimed that Rabbi Falk's work, the Pnei Yoshua, which again is still studied and is revered to this very day, is a work that's full of mistakes, and that he was 10 times the Kabbalist that Rabbi Falk was, and that we should have a Kabbalistic showdown. And he was also greatly resentful of the fact that there was any suggestion that he needed to do any kind of rehabilitation. Now, Rabbi Falk then forcefully began demanding that Rabbi Yonasan appear before a rabbinical panel, but this fell on deaf ears. Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz's support in the triple community was rock solid. Meanwhile, the same thing, as I said, was happening before. Rabbi Yaakov Emden is continuing to write his letters and spreading them all over Europe, trying to besmirch the Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz's reputation. And as I said, it was not the most effective policy. The Jewish world began to be divided into two camps. You had those who believed the accusations against Rabbi Yonasan and those who did not. Rabbi Yaakov again delegitimized his position by just being so extreme in his letters. He's still greatly revered in Europe. He's at that time, he's above reproach, but he's just protesting too much. It's at this point that we now have to talk about this guy. This is King Frederick V of Denmark. It's at this point that the monarchy starts hearing that there's trouble in Hamburg, and the king gets involved. This conflict raged. There was public disorder in the triple community, again, of Altona, Wandsbek, and Hamburg. Rabbi Yaakov Emden had a supporter. Rabbi Yaakov Emden had a friend by the name of Shmuel Heckscher, who we mentioned before. He was the guy who told Rabbi Yaakov Emden, your life is in danger, you need to clear out of Dodge. But he wrote a letter to his brother. His brother lived in Brunswick, and expressing questions about Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz's honesty. He also questioned, why is it that there's not a single German rabbi that's supporting Rabbi Yonasan? Everybody seems to falling down saying, yeah, there's a problem here, you got to do something. Well, his letter was intercepted by Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz's supporters, and he was humiliated in front of the community council. He was deposed of his position of authority on the council, and he was expelled from the city of Altona. Well, he appealed to King Frederick V. And remember, Hamburg is part of Denmark at this time. And although the Hamburg Council had no stake in the expulsion from Altona, which was in a different jurisdiction, it also demanded that Heckscher be readmitted to Altona. Otherwise, his antagonist would no longer be allowed to do business in Hamburg. So he's been kicked out of Altona, and he somehow appeals this decision to the community council, the secular community council of Hamburg. The Hamburg Community Council basically is telling the Jewish community, none of you folks are going to be able to do business in our community unless you take this guy back into your community. It's at this point that the royal court got involved, because this is now affecting the economy and the ability to collect taxes. So the royal court of Denmark in Copenhagen calls all the participants in front of him. So you now have Shmuel Heckscher, as well as the Hamburg Community Council, the seculars, the Gentiles Community Council, and the Jewish Community Council of the three communities. After a bitter fought battle in the royal court, the king ruled that Rabbi Yaakov could return home to Altona, and he should be allowed to operate his printing press. His businesses could reopen. He also decreed that Heckscher should be reinstated as a member of the community council of the triple community. In addition, Rabbi Yonasan was ordered to appear personally before the king to explain his attempts to overreach his authority and the answer to the claims of heresy that had been raised against him. It seemed finally that the tables had been turned, although rather than the controversy being sort of resolved by Jewish leadership, the non-Jewish courtroom would now be the focal point of this dispute. So this has now become pretty big. We're now dealing with monarchs, kings, and community councils. And it gets even more messy. So Rabbi Yaakov is sent word. Remember, he's in Amsterdam, and he's told that the king has ruled that he's allowed to return. He doesn't want to go. He just wants to stay in Amsterdam and do his thing. But a tearful emotional letter from his wife was sent out, and he returns. He's gone for 14 months. So again, this is all taking place over the course of a very short period of time. Notwithstanding his triumph, Rabbi Yaakov's situation was very unpleasant. Rabbi Yonasan was still the chief rabbi. He still had his defenders, and they were defiant. Rabbi Yaakov's financial situation was in disarray because of his prolonged absence. With each passing month, more rabbis, yes, initially the majority of rabbis seemed to side with him, but as things progressed, it seemed that, rabbis began to also come down on the side of Rabbi Yonasan. Rabbi Yaakov still persisted with his unrelenting campaign against Rabbi Yonasan, who he saw as epitomizing the dangers posed by the Shabbatean movement. Meanwhile, as mentioned earlier, King Frederick V of Denmark has demanded that Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz make an appearance before him. Now, this turn of events really disheartened Rabbi Yonasan. He wrote to his friends and colleagues, and again, he's the guy who's accused of being a Shabbatean, how disgusted he was that his opponents had resorted to the Gentile court system, which is counter to Jewish law. Now, in isolation, he's right. This might have been true, but in reality, he actually kind of forced the situation. He refused to acknowledge the accusations. He refused to answer any questions. He was just basically said, you got to trust me, guys. He never met with any rabbis about this. He would only go and speak in places where he knew he would not be challenged. So his protestations were rather disingenuous. He stamped out the opposition in a very extreme way, kicking Rabbi Yaakov Emden out of his home, his place where he had lived longer than Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz had been there. And again, Rabbi Yaakov Emden is a man above reproach as being sort of being stalwart and sterling without any negative accusation, again, except with this perhaps the zealot streak that he has. What else could Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz opponents do? So it's somewhat disingenuous. He probably was just upset that things were no longer going his way. So in anticipation of the upcoming court case, Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz engaged the services of a former student, a man who had converted to Christianity by the name of Carl Anton. I tried to find pictures of Carl Anton. I couldn't find any, but Carl Anton converted to Christianity after being a student of Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz. He changed his name and eventually became a professor of Hebrew in the Helmstadt University in Würzburg in Bavaria. So, what do we do here? Well, there could be no better person to have requested to stand up and advocate on his behalf. As a professor in a Gentile college, he was completely comfortable explaining the arcane nature of rabbinic material to the uninitiated. And after being tutored by Rabbi Yonasan in the technicalities of word formulations and Kabbalistic amulets, how much more time do I have? I really can't see so well.
7:30.
Okay, we're doing okay. Okay, we're doing great. Okay, he was completely comfortable, and he also could speak German perfectly, which was the language of the Royal Court of Denmark. Go figure, but that's just the way it was. So he mastered his brief before presenting the case. And this trial attracted the attention of many journalists, religious scholars, and jurists from all over Europe, eager to find out more about the secretive world of Jewish mysticism and the details of its practical application. Anton was undaunted by the packed courtroom, and he took the obscure Kabbalistic background that underpinned the amulet authorship and submitted a compelling case on behalf of his client. Now, it's a very long and drawn-out description. He is very articulate. He basically exclaimed that letters gets converted for other letters. You do not have words that are spelled out. You in fact just have specific letters of the Aleph Beis that refer to individual names of Hashem and biblical verses. Yeah, a lot of things could be misconstrued as any number of things. You can interpret the dimensions of a pizza kiosk to have some kind of Kabbalistic imagery as well, or significance. You could do that here. If you were looking for ways to connect these amulets, the Shabbatai Tzvi, the possibilities are endless. But again, as had been claimed until this point, unless you're initiated into the secrets of the Kabbalah, you cannot really pass judgment. And again, he went on to perhaps explain away the language and the what the letters might refer to that were understood to be Shabbatean in nature. And he also told the king, get out of the religion business. You're a secular leader. Don't do this. which perhaps was compelling to a degree to the modern mind. But in those days, there was no separation of church and state, as evidenced in the fact that the Jews had their own community council who appointed rabbis and charged taxes and managed the police forces and things of that sort. There was no separation of church and state at that time. The king retired with his advisors, and he considered the evidence. When they returned to the courtroom, the verdict was unequivocal. In the first instance, Rabbi Yonasan was completely exonerated of the charges. He would never be allowed by secular law to be accused of having any Shabbatian association. So the king now has changed his mind and has sided with Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz, the accused Shabbatian. Secondly, because in order to remove any doubt as to the position that Rabbi Yonasan held in the community, he ordered that there be a new election for the chief rabbi at the first possible opportunity, in order to ensure that there will be no question of the legitimacy of Rabbi Yonasan's position as the chief rabbi of the triple community. And those elections took place the following December. Rabbi Yonasan was overwhelmingly reelected. But the unexpected victory and vindication were quickly diminished by other events. Almost immediately after his re-election as chief rabbi, the Hamburg Community Council, the secular authorities, which had the authority to reject the king's verdict and the election result, because the city of Hamburg was a free city. It was in Denmark, but it wasn't Danish. It was a city-state that did not have to submit itself to the royal decree. So now you have this problem where you have a triple community council that's administrating to the Jewish needs, that is appointed by the city councils of these three different cities, with one city basically delegitimizing the entire triple community council and rejecting the chief rabbi's office for its Jewish citizens. So you have this really, really wonky mess that, like, who would know how to handle this kind of a situation? So we really have a real pickle. Everything's in disorder, everything's in chaos, and more things seem to happen even outside of the triple community. With this latest twist, the battle between rabbis all over Europe as to how to deal with Rabbi Yonasan's alleged Shabbatinism began to escalate as positions hardened and enmity increased. So you have two camps that have developed within the rabbinic leadership all over Europe, and they're falling on one side or the other. Rabbi Yonasan's strategy vis-a-vis his rabbinic accusers had been consistent throughout. He was only willing to present his version of what the amulets meant in a setting that did not include anyone qualified to challenge his versions. This was his position throughout the controversy, and he resorted to numerous tactics to make sure that he would never be forced into any kind of a hostile rabbinic hearing. As far as Rabbi Yaakov was concerned, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who was the accuser, this evasive attitude alone proved that Rabbi Yonasan was guilty. And it was inevitable that these two camps would emerge among the European rabbinate. One group presumed that Rabbi Yonasan's guilt, but couldn't formulate an effective strategy to deal with it. And the other group that presumed his innocence, but seemed unable to find a way to silence the critics. So again, you have this unsurmountable problem, this argument that cannot be resolved, that has now spread from the city of Hamburg's Jewish community to the secular community as well, to the national community with the involvement of the King Frederick V of Denmark. And it's now spreading all over Europe as rabbis fall into one camp or another, either in support or against, neither side able to completely overpower the other. It was at this point that Rabbi Yecheskel Landau stepped into the picture. Now, you might remember him. He was the first rabbi alive that we spoke about in the last class. He was the gentleman who paskined that the two, Rabbi Yaakov Emden and Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz, could be buried next to each other. And here you have their headstones. On the right is Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz. On the left is Rabbi Yaakov Emden. They're buried next to each other in the cemetery of Hamburg. We spoke about the story. But that was many years later. That was about 20 years later. It's at this point that he steps in for the first time. Rabbi Landau, he's also known as the Noda B'Yehuda, will become famous as the chief rabbi of Prague. But at this point, he was only 39 years old. He was relatively unknown. He was a rabbi in the city of Yampoi, which is a small town in the Ukraine, about 1,000 miles from Hamburg. He'd never met either Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz or Rabbi Yaakov Emden. They were both old enough to be his father. But for some unknown reason, and he was a natural leader of men, he felt compelled to resolve this epic dispute that had erupted between these two rabbinic titans. To that end, he wrote a letter, the letter of reconciliation. I attempted to try and find a copy of it, like a reproduction. I couldn't find any, but you'll have to trust me that he has beautiful handwriting. I should have taken a picture of one and shared that, but I didn't. Anyways, so he wrote he suggested a compromise solution that allowed both Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz and Rabbi Yaakov Emden, along with their supporters, to walk away with their pride and reputations intact. The letter was very diplomatically worded, and it was very cleverly constructed. It painted Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz as one of the greatest rabbis of the time, whose understandable but misplaced treatment of Rabbi Yaakov Emden stained his otherwise relatively unblemished reputation. It was a wrong that he had to put right, especially as Rabbi Yaakov Emden clearly had grounds to behave as he did. He found something Shabbatian, something that was concerning, and he had the right to speak out and say, you need to account for this. Excommunicating him and hounding him out of town was not an appropriate way to behave towards a very distinguished rabbi, particularly Rabbi Yaakov, whose dedication to the most stringent of Torah-observant life and whose positive influence on those around him was beyond question. Again, he was revered in his day, and he's still revered now. It was not appropriate that he should have been put in the band that he was and treated in such a manner. Rabbi Landau clearly examined the notarized amulets from Metz and was convinced that they contained formulations that referred to Shabbatai Tzvi. But he had two superb observations to make. The first was these notarized amulets did not have standing in a Beis Din. They don't have standing in the Beis Din unless the individuals in question are present at the time that they're being notarized. So therefore, no Beis Din was obligated to accept these amulets as evidence of him being a Shabbatian. Yes, he probably was a Shabbatian, but in terms of how Beis Din and how Jewish law operates, there's nothing that a Beis Din could do to pass any kind of a sentence on him. He did at later times, as was mentioned earlier, and in some of his letters, admit that he wrote them, and he claimed that there were mistakes, however, but there was nothing that would, in fact, make him liable in a court of law for heresy, because these are not admissible forms of evidence. So he had a way to be that he could essentially say, I didn't write them, guys. The next position was, even if he was a believer in Shabbatai Tzvi, if he never mentions Shabbatai Tzvi and his behavior is completely Torah observant in every other manner, we don't have the evidence to accuse him of being a follower of Shabbatai Tzvi. So therefore, according to halacha, we have no grounds to perhaps throw him in jail and lock the door and lose the key. He has the ability to say that I did not write those amulets. He is not liable in any court of law. And if he were to just disavow any connection to Shabbatai Tzvi, then according to halacha, there's nothing more that can be done. He can maintain his post as long as he makes a commitment to never writing an amulet again and never mentioning Shabbatai Tzvi in any way. Basically, he provided an out, basically saying, I'm not saying you're innocent, but we can't try you. These are a list of conditions I think you ought to abide so that you can retain your position as rabbi, and Rabbi Yaakov Emden can find the solace and closure that he needs, and you need to publicly apologize for his treatment. Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz agreed. He agreed to this proposal. He agreed to this proposal because it provided him an honorable out, and it was based on this halachic decision of the Noda B'Yehuda that Rabbi Yonasan Eibeschutz's Sfarim, his works, are still broadly studied today. Yes, he was probably a Shabbatian, but if that never makes its way into anything that he writes, and if he never acts on it, and he never writes another amulet, then there is no reason not to keep him as part of the Jewish world. As long as he's not advocating that we not keep Shabbos anymore, he still has a certain level of hechsher to him. Yonasan Eybeschutz agreed, Rabbi Yaakov Emden did not. He was not in the mood of any kind of compromise. And as far as he was concerned, this was a holy war. And Rabbi Yonasan needed to be defrocked. Rabbi Yonasan needed to be humiliated. And no other end was acceptable. He attacked the pamphlet, the letter of reconciliation, and he also called Rabbi Yecheskel Landau, the Noda Yehuda, the man who would go on. He was a generation younger than these two rabbis, who would go on in the next 20 years or so to become probably one of the most important halachic authorities in Europe at that time. And I'll tell you about a halachic decision that he came to that we still enjoy to this very day. He accused him of being a closet Shabbatian as well. The controversy essentially reached a stalemate. Rabbi Yonasan remained the chief rabbi of Altona. In Hamburg, his powers were stripped away by the city council. And by the time they were reinstated some years later, the issue had largely become irrelevant. In the rabbinic world, Rabbi Yonasan and Eybeschutz opponents were unyielding in their antipathy for him, and they continued to insist that he was an unrepentant heretic. Rabbi Yaakov continued to publish regular attacks against his nemesis, and in 1760, the controversy gained new lease on life when Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz's son came out. He revealed himself as a Shabbatian prophet. Several students of his in his yeshiva became adamant or vocal supporters of Shabbatai Tzvi. He wasn't saying or doing anything officially, but this was quite bad for his reputation, and his yeshiva was shut down for good. Ultimately, it was Rabbi Landau's resolution that was the blueprint for future generations. Rabbi Yonasan's extensive scholarship was recorded in numerous works. They were published in his lifetime after he passed away, and they're mainstays of Jewish learning to this very day. And principally as a result of Rabbi Landau's suggestion that if someone is in every sense a devout Jew and an exemplary rabbi, unverifiable aberrations ascribed to him should be disregarded. Rabbi Yaakov is equally venerated as an exemplary rabbi who fought a valiant battle against the man he regarded as a dangerous heretic, and his works on Talmud, on halacha, and prayer continue to be widely used and respected also. So in the final analysis, who is right, who is wrong, I haven't the foggiest notion. Was Rabbi Yonasan a Shabbatian? Yeah, the evidence seems to indicate that he was. I did take a look at some of those amulets, and it's kind of, they're available online. You can find them if you track them down in research, in academic publications. They're there as well. Yeah, he probably was a follower of Shabbatai Tzvi. It's pretty clear. But did he use that in any way to lead people astray, have them stop keeping Shabbos, studying Torah? No, which makes things really complicated. Belief in a dead Mashiach that converted to Islam is probably a mishigas. Is that outright heresy? I don't know. I'm not that big a Talmud Chacham, but it's definitely a mishigas. Is a mishigas punishable? I don't know. It depends on what the mishigas is, I suppose. But according to the Noda Yehuda, it isn't. And as such, Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz remains a venerated rabbi whose opinions are still cited. His works are still studied, as is his main opponent, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, also revered, cited, and largely studied. They both died several decades after this argument broke out. This argument broke out in 1751, in 752, in 753. That's where the court case takes place. That's where all of this fighting occurs. Rabbi Yaakov Emden passes away about 12 years after Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz. Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz passes away in 1764, and Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz passes away in 1764, and Yonasan Eybeschutz in 1764. Rabbi Yaakov, I keep thinking I'm saying it's Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz earlier, 1764. Rabbi Yaakov Emden, 1776. 12 years later, they both pass away, and at that point, perhaps finally the controversy came to some kind of a resolution. And if you recall the story, the last words on Rabbi Yaakov Emden's lips were, "Welcome, Rabbi Yonasan, welcome, my father." The Noda Yehuda happened to be in town, and he said, "Oy bazoi, as the only burial spot in the respected place in the cemetery, the place for rabbis, the only place available, is that spot for that spot that happens to be right next to Rabbi Yonasan Eybeschutz, since they made peace and it was witnessed by the Chacham Tzvi. It must be that the two finally found some resolution and they can be buried next to each other. And again, here we have the picture of their two headstones. They're not literally next to each other. They're a few paces away, but they're awfully close. And that concludes the greatest rabbinic fight of the millennium, with many unresolved questions and not very well responded to answers. I'm now open to questions, comments, and or rebuttals. Oh, so the question: what is something about Rabbi Yonasan, the Noda B'Yehuda? What's a psak that he gave that is still used, that is still in application? Well, if you're drinking beer, you're enjoying his halachic psak, because in the very early days of lagers, they were filtering it with a product called isinglass, which is made from the bladder of a sturgeon fish, and which is a non-kosher fish. It's a gelatinous product that comes from fish that they use to filter out. They used to filter out the sediment in beer to make it clear. Isinglass, it's clear, a clear glass, or it's a beautiful glass. It's anyways, it's so he paskined that since it does not give any flavor, and in fact you do not want it to remain there, you want it to be filtered out. It's taking all the particulates and it's removing them from the beer, and then you're just drawing the beer off the top, all the sediments on the bottom in this gelatinous substance, and the gelatinous substance isn't going with the beer. You're allowed to drink that beer because the gelatinous substance does not contribute any flavor to the final product. And there are still craft breweries that still use isinglass. If you have ever enjoyed a glass of Guinness, you can thank the Noda B'Yehuda for enjoying that beer. And that's a great way to end the story. And we'll close the recording here. And I am still open for questions, comments, or rebuttals.